Hello and welcome to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast with me, your host, Shiv Sengupta. I'm the author of the Advaitaholics Anonymous series, Sobering Insights for Spiritual Addicts, Volume 2, a Manifesto for Spiritual Anarchy, and the newly published Volume 3, titled An Antidote to Spiritual Enlightenment. All three books were published by New Sarum Press. Today's podcast is a conversation between Joan, Tollifson, Judy, Cohen, and I hope you enjoy. All right,
so you were talking about formalizing methods versus intuition.
Yes, so recently I was, without getting into too much detail, in a situation where I was suddenly thrust into a position to help a friend who was on the cusp of taking his own life. And there was no opportunity or support system around him. The medical system had failed him. The hospital system didn't know what to do about it. And I realized all these protocols, all these techniques in place that society's created all fall flat in the moment when push comes to shove and a person's on the knife edge, nothing works, right? And so I reached out to him, and we spent 10 days together just working through it. And he's in a very different place now. He's re-engaged in his life. And none of it was anything I've truly ever done before. It was just in the moment, whatever inspiration came, realizing that I'm all he's got. And we have to work through this somehow. And just connecting with another human being from that place of truth, whatever that truth feels like to you in that moment, being as authentic as I possibly can, knowing I'm not an expert, knowing I don't have the skill sets, the techniques, none of that, but what I do have is my own intuitive guidance that has never really failed me, right? And so circling back to what we were just talking about just before we started recording, I believe a lot of these techniques that come out of spiritual teachings have once upon a time been intuited by some individual, right? They've been thrust in a situation in life, or they've had some great revelation where they've come to a certain understanding. And then they try to put it into some kind of a formula that can then be applied. And what I'm saying is that unless the person applying that formula has intuited it themselves, in which case the formula wouldn't even be required because it would be redundant, that technique cannot truly be effective. It can work at a superficial level, maybe, bring some temporary relief, but it can't have that impact because what's lacking is the whole essence, the power behind that drive. It's not so much what you do, it's where the intention, the energy comes from. It's a completely different place than from up here, right? And so we were talking about a little bit about certain teachers and their techniques before we started recording. And I think they're all, there's some utility to them. But at the end of the day, they will truly fall flat when push comes to shove, when a person is truly in need of that kind of thing. Right.
When we were talking earlier, and I said to you guys that I only wish that I could control my mouth, and that I can't, that stuff comes out of it. That I often wish I could stop, but cannot. And I think that it's that same kind of thing. There has to be at some point a trust in wherever it is that whatever it is that sends ideas, wherever it is that ideas and intuition and creativity, wherever that comes from, it comes out here. Or, if you're painting, for instance, it'll come out in the hands, or if you're dancing, it'll come out in your feet or whatever. But it doesn't come from figuring out step by step how to follow some plan. Because whatever sends those ideas for you to know what to say to your friend, it's not following a plan. And if it is following a plan, it's not telling you what it is. So I think that ability, I get asked this all the time. How do you tell the difference? How does one tell the difference between the mind's voice, and let's call it intuition's voice, or consciousness, or creative, whatever word you want to put, God, source, whatever name you put on it. How do you tell the difference between how do you know which one is talking? And I think that there's a difference in feeling, and there is a difference in trust. And if you're going to trust a method, you're going to miss a lot. You're going to narrow down something enormous into something small, and it's going to fall short. You know, how does somebody learn how to make that, how to have that kind of trust? I mean, I don't even know. At some point, I have to be grateful for my inability to control my mouth, because something does the talking for me. So that we don't leave it up to Judy.
When
I'm done. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, as I was mentioning, I just finished reading Shiv's new book, Volume 3 of Advaitaholics Anonymous, and which I really liked. And you talk in that, Shiv, about intuition, and it was a chapter that really struck me quite deeply. And I probably can't remember it completely, but you know, you were saying something like, with intuition, what intuition is sort of telling you to do may be at odds with what would be comfortable, what would be secure, what would be rational, and maybe something very scary. And I can really feel that, you know, in terms of some of the things that I feel intuitively, like I'm moved to do or not do, and then are in conflict with, and I've noticed that as I get older, I'm in my 70s now, that concerns with security seem to be a bit more, in some ways more up than they were. You know, when I could care less when I was, you know, in my 20s and 30s about anything to do with security. Whereas now it's kind of like you start to have all these thoughts, or at least I do, and I think most people do as they get to a certain age, about what happens if I get dementia, what happens if I have a stroke, do I have enough money to get through this, and et cetera, et cetera. And I was in a meeting with someone, you know, I do these meetings with people. I was in a meeting with someone the other day, and we were talking about doing this kind of work, you know, meeting with people and stuff like that. And he said, well, why do you hold meetings? And I said, well, to be honest, a large part of it is that I need the income stream. And he was great. I mean, he said, if you hadn't said that, I would have thought you were full of shit. But I mean, for me, it was kind of a big moment, because it was like, you know, I think I don't remember anyone ever asking me that before, but if they did, I would have probably said something like, which would also be true, you know, something about, well, I'm just doing what I can't not do. I don't have any agenda or anything. This is what life is moving me to do. You know, I would have said something like that, which is also true, but it leaves out a certain part of it that is not considered spiritually appropriate. And so that seemed like it came out of what we're calling intuition. You know, it came out of that place of just, I'm going to be honest here. And which is, again, can be scary. So, and it felt very liberating. it felt incredibly liberating, like sort of releasing a dark secret or something, you know, and so.
How funny
Yeah,
that we happen to live in a world, in a community, in a scene where admitting that we need income is something shameful. So strange.
yeah, absolutely. And you know, I recently wrote an article addressing a similar question somebody had. If they were expressing, you know, they had issues and fears about the future. And first of all, I don't think there's a single person alive who doesn't have fears about the future. They're either in denial of it and actively trying to cover it up, or they're facing the fact that they have fears about the future. I think these fears are healthy to have. If at your age, with the history of health issues that you already have, to not ask the question, well, what do I do if I have a stroke or get dementia? You don't have people, you know, surviving you. Who's going to take care of you? It's a valid question to ask. Well, if your spiritual community is not really going to come and look after your everyday, day-to-day needs, they
Can
might
you imagine?
yeah, you might set up a GoFundMe page if Joan has a stroke or dementia.
And then
Let's
they'll be
hope
mad
somebody
at
can
you for
actually-
doing it.
Right? And then we, oh, well, she wasn't as enlightened as we thought, but let's take care of her anyway.
She's just asking for money. Yeah.
But
Yep.
who's gonna come and bring you your meals every day? Who's gonna do that? So Joan's got to look after herself. Joan's got to figure out, well, what am I going to do? And guess what? This gig that Joan has is the one that's paying the bills. So Joan's going to keep doing it. And there's absolutely, in my mind, my opinion, nothing wrong with that. The problem is that we're always trying to put a spin on it. That's the problem I have with this entire industry. Is we're spinning it in another way in order to make it appear to be something it's not. Why can't we just get a paycheck? It's fine. But call it that. And what ends up happening is this blurring of lines between spiritual ideals, which are on the one hand, and practical realities and necessities on the other hand. No matter how enlightened you are, you still got to take a shit. You still got to put food on the table. You still got to change that colostomy bag of yours. Raman is not going to do it for you, right?
But here's where I think it starts to get blurry, and maybe accounts for a little bit of the confusion, perhaps, is because we do naturally plan and we do naturally think, try not doing it. I mean, good luck, about the future, what's coming and how we can get ready. It's just like going on a trip. You have to pack a suitcase. You have to anticipate what's coming as best you can. Where I think it begins to get blurry is that in the end, what comes is often not what was anticipated, and in big ways. So you can plan for what will I do if I have a stroke and die in your sleep, or in other words, we plan because we must. The human likes to have control of things and likes to figure things out and likes to be ready and likes to be protected, and that's not going to change. And at the same time, unexpected, unplanned for things happen, and life does its own thing regardless. And so I think this is kind of like the mix, Shiv, of intuition and unexpected, who knows where it comes from, mixed with the human inclination to be in charge and figure things out and get ready. And we do the best we can with that mix, perpetually being surprised, despite our plans. I mean, I go on these dance weekends and I pack a bag and I throw in the clothes that I think I might need. And in the end, I always wear the same couple of things 2 or 3 times. But I've got the whole big suitcase. And, but do I know in advance which of those things I'm going to end up choosing? No. So they all have to go in the bag and we do our best. And so I think that these lines get blurred because they are blurry. We're doing our best. But I think the more room we can make for, well, we'll see. the easier it might be for us.
Yeah, I
And-
think, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say then trying to figure out every contingency, what is going to happen to me between now and when I'm 80?
Oh, yeah.
You know,
No, I mean, I think obsessing over it and trying to plan it all out doesn't work, but
miserable.
I was just like, for example, I've moved into a retirement community, which does provide certain things. And, so you can make, but you can't, like, I never expected to get anal cancer. I mean, that wasn't on my map of things that may happen. But, I think this kind of gets to the thing about how spirituality tends, not in I think that we can, like, there's a lot of different forms of spirituality, so I want to avoid overgeneralizing, but there's certainly a tendency to kind of leave out this practical everyday side and focus on, and not all forms of spirituality are about transcendence. I mean, Zen is very down to earth, for example, and is not about getting somewhere, getting enlightened. At least none of the teachers I've had. But certainly in the Advaita world, there's that much more of that sort of transcendent kind of feeling. And I've been kind of looking lately a lot at the whole question of the self. What is the self? Because, and I've been kind of interested in distinguishing from, different things, like there's the organism, there's the person, there's the self, there's the ego, there's the personality, there's these various different words. And I think they actually point to kind of different things. And that they're, yes, I mean, if we pause and close our eyes, we can tune into this sort of vast, aware presence that has no gender, no age, no location, no shape, no size, et cetera, et cetera. But then we open our eyes and, we are 3 distinct individual human beings in real life situations. And they're both real. Both of these things are real. And whatever that might mean, real, that's another question. But yeah, it feels to me like, a lot of the sort of spiritual focus on no self, not self, like there's certainly an aspect of the self or whatever we're talking about that can be problematic, that has to do with sort of feeling separate and feeling separate and cut off and trying to control the universe and maybe the whole question of identity is also really interesting. Like that's maybe the part that feels a need to identify as something. Anyway, so I toss those out as some of the things I've been pondering.
And, when I think about the word spirituality, and I've written about this before, I don't see it as being something opposed or juxtaposed against anything. My definition or understanding of spirituality is inclusive of everything, including the practical aspects of life, including this separate self that's playing a role of Joan or Judy or Shiv, including all the various scenarios we're in, because fundamentally, all those experiences are still the experiences of being. None of those experiences are divorced from it. They're add-on experiences, they're overlays to the experience, but they're still experiences of being. So all of it is part of one's spirituality. So regardless of where one falls, regardless of where one's understanding lies, whether it's on the very superficial personality level, or it goes much deeper to the level of being and awareness, it's still all spirituality, as far as I'm concerned. So the corporate businessman who's never heard of Advaita or non-duality or Buddhism or whatever, has just been on one track to think about how much his investments are going to make on a day-to-day basis, is experiencing that brand of spirituality. And you and Judy and I, as we're discussing, this level beyond that identified state of a person on a certain path in the social drama, are identifying another layer of spirituality, but it's all spirituality at the end of the day. Spirituality is just simply the experience of being. This form that we happen to have is the only access point we have. I think where there's a benefit to probing beneath the layers is especially when living at a certain level no longer works for a person. It then becomes an opportunity to dive deeper. So if one is purely superficial and they have no awareness of even their emotional states, they're just very sort of abstractly caught up in life, then their life may orchestrate events where they need to suddenly become more emotionally aware, right? Beyond that, life may orchestrate scenarios where they need to become more spiritually aware. None of that means that one is discovering something new about spirituality. It just means that they're delving deeper and deeper and deeper. But essentially, it still is all spirituality. This idea that only those exploring the level of being are spiritual people versus those who are caught up in the material world or non-spiritual beings is a bit of a misunderstanding. And I've always tried to orient people's perspective a little bit away from that.
And it's still,
Shiv, as you're speaking there, I don't know if, I assume everyone else is hearing it. There's a kind of jingling sound. Are you hearing that too, Judy?
I am. The mic might
hitting on your microphone or something.
or it could be the button, the button on your collar.
It's the microphone. I have a tendency to talk with my hands and probably banging my microphone.
Yeah,
so
that's what I think it was. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I do the same. So when I have a jacket with a zipper or whatever, I have to tuck it in because it bangs against the mic. My version of enlightenment ironically came about with a sense, I'm not going to go into details, but with a sense that I am literally a feeling, a thought, a sound. So that sense of no self was palpable for me. And yet, ironically, what I do as I'm working is I enter through what you called, Joan, the real life. I enter through the everyday. I enter through the self, the sense of self and the story of self and the personality and its likes and its dislikes and its and it all ends up in the same place because it really doesn't matter. It's just funny. This is kind of where tonight's Mind Tickler is ending up. We'll see if that's what comes out tomorrow or not. But in the end, it really doesn't even matter if we see it. It still is what it is. So in other words, if I know there's a pothole in the road coming or I don't, there's still a pothole in the road. And so if I disregard, if my version of spirituality is to discount and disregard the self and thought and mind and ego and personality and say, no, that's not it, or that's a wrong version, how do you account? Because these folks that understand that maybe we are everything, are we everything but not that?
Mm-hmm.
It's not, it doesn't fit. And so why discount what is so strong for us all, this sense, I am Judy and you are Shiv and you are Joan and you are not me. That sense is strong. Why discount it? It all ends up in the same pothole anyway. So it's kind of, I don't know if I'm being clear here, but this game of the self with its identity and its story and its quirks and its likes and its preferences and its dreams and all of that can be painful sometimes. And I think that the pain can send us off in various directions that the self might not ordinarily want to go. But it's not to be discounted. There's too much of it. It's almost, this is a crazy word to use. it's almost disrespectful to discount what there's so much of. It always strikes me too, sometimes it's the same thing with feelings. Like, I want peace, I want love, I don't want anger. When there's so much of it, you have to wonder at one point, what kind of arrogance says we are everything but not that? What kind of, isn't that another way to basically enhance the sense of self, for it to determine what we are and what's good and what isn't? Am I being clear? I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, you know, I mean, it's like there's kind of two different perspectives that are both true in my mind, the absolute and the relative. In other words, like, everything is what is. And in that sense, you know, like, I often give this example of, you know, Hitler and Buddha. They're both equally the ocean. They're both equally waves. They're both equally movements of the ocean. But I'd rather Buddha knows that. Buddha sees that. Buddha realizes that. Hitler doesn't. Hitler is operating under the illusion of being a separate, independent wave who has to deal, you know, and so they are going to feel very different as a result of that, and they're going to act very different as a result of that. So it's like, is there anything, I mean, relatively, yeah, there is good and bad. I mean, and there's this bug flying around me. There's always a bug. But then in the absolute sense, there is no good, there is no bad. It's all, you know, it's all relative. And you know, and it seems to me that, like, there are certain parts of what we're, like, I think the illusion is that there's some kind of central coherent self. I mean, it seems like both neuroscience and psychology have seen through that. There isn't any kind of central entity in here. And yes, I mean, I also have the experience of just being thoughts, feelings, you know, sensations, etc. And then I also have, not all the time, but, you know, intermittently, like, a sense of being, I'm a particular age, a particular, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this for me recently came up in this, I posted something about the whole transgender struggle, and I don't really want to get into that whole thing in depth, but and I had considered transitioning at one point and then decided not to. And so I've had the experience of, you know, not feeling like I'm in, you know, and the only way I can describe it to somebody who hasn't had that experience is to imagine how you would feel if you had to go around in some set of clothing that's completely alien to you, whether that might be a dress or some bizarre bathing suit or whatever it might be. If you had to sort of go through your day in some sort of clothing that felt just not right to you, what would that feel like? And yet, what does it mean to, what is it that's male or female? I mean, I don't want to get into the whole question of gender here so much, but it's brought up a lot of, talking about this with various people recently has brought up a lot of just sort of these questions about what are we talking about when we talk about the self? Like, you know, I don't know if I'm being clear, if this is, because it feels like there are all these aspects that are like very real, as you were saying, Judy. Like, we do have preferences, you know, we do have survival needs, and we have a personality in the sense that it's not a solid thing, but we do have certain habitual tendencies in terms of extroverted, introverted, all those kinds of things, you know. And we have certain talents and gifts and certain, you know, all of that is there. And we can have these feelings of being, you know, comfortable in our skin, so to speak, or not comfortable in our skin, so to speak. And yeah, I feel like I'm kind of rambling and maybe going off in too many different tangents, but there's something in that, all that is very juicy for me right now. And I'm obviously processing it because, you know, I don't feel like I'm saying it all very clearly, but
Well, what I wanted to add to what Juicy, you just said the word juicy, so I'm calling Judy Juicy. What I wanted to add to what Judy was saying is that for me, when I look at people, I find the sense of self as absolutely miraculous, precisely because it can't be found. Like if you showed me a hand, I mean, that's miraculous too, but we can all agree there's a hand there and we can all see it, we can all touch it. But the sense of self is so ephemeral. And yet you poll 100 people, almost 100 of them will tell you that their sense of self feels more real to them than their hand. Well, how does that happen? I mean, that's just phenomenal to me. That 7.8 billion individual selves are walking around on the planet right now, completely convinced they are this unique entity.
It's wild.
That's what makes life beautiful, because if it wasn't that, you just have this weird ocean of energy just flowing around. That's it. That would be the end of the story. Except now you have drama, you have intrigue, you have horror, you have comedy, you have Netflix on a global scale. Entertainment 24/7, always on. That to me is miraculous. How does that happen from a universe that looks completely inanimate? It's just gases, nebulae, galaxies, somehow all evolved into this. Blows my mind every time I think about it. So when somebody comes to me with a problem of, oh, my sense of self is suffering, secretly I'm thinking, oh man, what a miraculous experience you're having. But on the personal level, I can understand how that can become a burden, because self is really artistic expression. That's the way I see self. It's just the most fundamental form of artistic expression. But if you end up painting a prison or bars every day, eventually your own art will become oppressive to you and sort of dominate your life. And in that arena, there is an opportunity to then step out and see that the self is really an illusion that your own mind is creating for a reason, and it's a beautiful reason. Don't misunderstand why it's happening. And that's the perspective we can lend. But to do away with the self entirely and then, inhabit the zone, it can't even be done. But even if you somehow, put yourself into some kind of altered state where you kind of, existing there, I've never even seen that as an enviable position to be in.
Agreed. They put you away. That you have to know who you are. And you have to defend that self. You have to know that self, defend that self, protect that self. And if you don't enough, they will literally put you away, because there's just no room for that here. I remember reading, there's not a lot of information like this out there. There's just a little. I read a story about Ramana getting angry at one of his helpers who had served him some food because the helper had put too much food on the plate. And Ramana basically said, I'm paraphrasing and making a mess of this, but basically Ramana said, you can't give me more. You can't give me so much. There are people out there who need this. Don't be good. People will think, these are not his words, people will think I'm being greedy. I'm taking on more than I deserve, when there are other people. That was a man protecting his sense of self in that instance. So if he sees himself or saw himself as a generous person who was interested in other people and helping other people and not being greedy and not being selfish and etc. And so if Ramana could not be free of that sense of identity, however soft and hazy it might have been, I don't know, who can do it? Who can do it? Who has done it? Where is the evidence even that it's doable to eliminate, for whatever reason, a sense of self? You can see through it, you can see it for what it is, you can experience moments where You don't, where it isn't strong, but you can be called out of it in a heartbeat by your name. So in other words, what I mean by that is, in those moments where I had a sense, for instance, of being everything and not being there, etc., all you needed to do was say, Judy, and it'd be over.
Yeah.
So, and how do we function in this life, in this world, how without it?
Well, here's a question. Were you finished? Because
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Like, okay, we were talking about defending the self, and I mean, obviously there is the organism has a natural survival instinct that to defend itself, that's there. And then there's kind of what we might call egoic self-defense, which has some reality to the organism to it. In other words, if everybody really thinks I'm a piece of shit and hates me, you know, that would be equivalent to being left on the tundra to die by the tribe, you know, and I would die because we live in a social context where I need other people. You know, none of us can survive entirely alone. So, so there's some organismic, if that's a word, survival reality, even to some degree with that kind of thing. But then there's this kind of psychological defensiveness. For example, if on Facebook, somebody appears to be not really respecting me and making comments that seem to be sort of putting me down or whatever, a feeling of defensiveness or, you know, feeling hurt, defended, angry, whatever can arise. And it feels to me like that's what we're pointing to as kind of the illusory sense of self, you know, as I would see it. That's the kind of sense of self that's both illusory. I'm defending a kind of illusion. I'm defending, you know, some image really of myself.
Exactly.
That this person is in some way threatening. And it feels to me like a lot of what the spiritual path has involved in my case has been, obviously not successfully, but has involved, you know, seeing that as it happens, and if not, you know, and sometimes not having to react to it, and that feels, of course, there's a potential, you know, obviously there's a potential trap there in that, and you see this a lot in spiritual groups where people get caught up in a new self-image of being somebody who's, you know, never angry, never defensive, et cetera, and trying to suppress parts of myself and all that. So it's a fine line there. But it does seem to me like there's some value in trying to be Buddha and not Hitler, so to speak. I mean, given, and I'm speaking here, you know, knowing that both of those in some shape are inside of each one of us, you know. And so what do you think?
Well, you know, you broke the self down into three categories, but I really see them only in those two categories, the two initial ones you mentioned. One being the organism itself, the biological organism, and that sense of self that the body has. And then the second being the social self, related to the social structure upon which the body's survival depends, because the more complex the animal, the more complex the social hierarchy, the more complex the game of survival becomes, because now you need to make good with the other creatures so they don't leave you out to dry on the tundra, right? As you so succinctly put it. Now, what I think has happened over time is, as society has become more and more complex, because our awareness has completely gotten sucked into managing the optics of life at all times, because we're always in some kind of social scenario or the other. Over time, that just becomes the only focus, the sole focus, to the extent that we then begin to look at ourselves through the lens that we're projecting to society. So now the Joan that you are seeing is actually the Joan that you are projecting out to the world. You don't actually see the Joan before the projection, right? I'm not singling you out. This is just an example. Joan, the example is, as a child, as a very young child, I had no sense of my self-identity in relation to my social setup. But as I grow and these little social rules of engagement become more and more complex, I begin to think about them more and more, figuring out, okay, how do I get this person to like me, or how do I exclude this person from the games we play? That becomes my sole preoccupation. Because I've been seeing myself only through those interactions, at a certain point, I forget there was ever another version of me prior to that image that I'm always projecting. And that becomes the crisis point, because we become so obsessed with the image we are projecting, we forget that there's a deeper level to self than that image, right? And then it becomes to the point of nitpicking. Literally, it could be a comment on Facebook, because at the end of the day, your social survival as a spiritual teacher does depend on how you're perceived in the spiritual community, and as well based on, you know, the level of respect people show you. These are things that are part and parcel of it. And this is why, you know, when a person's livelihood becomes tied into their role as a spiritual teacher, the stakes go up, because now how they're perceived literally translates into dollar figures. And we were talking a little bit earlier before we started recording about certain individuals who present in a very different manner than they turn into when their image is threatened, and rightly so. It's not surprising. It's almost to be expected, because that is how the ego works. And the ego is really, to me, really our social identity. It's the role we're playing on the stage and the drama of society. Nobody has the time or the inclination to try and really get to know who Joan is, or what the experience of Joan feels like. They never will. They will only ever interact with the facade. And so it's your responsibility and my responsibility to be as authentic as we can, to try and reduce that veneer of the facade down to a paper-thin margin, so that something of the essence of our being gets through in our relationships. And that is, I think, the spiritual process. We'll never tear through that, because we're always, the other person's perception is part of what we're trying to break through. And we can't break through that level, right?
See, I see all of that a little differently. I don't think there is anything but the facade. I think that's why we're so quick to defend it. There is nothing to be authentic. What would be authentic? So what is it? It's not the skin, the bones, the muscles. They're not interested in authenticity, and they don't need to be. And so what is? Just the image. So I don't see it as well, what else?
Well, to
What
me,
else?
Judy, authenticity has to do with nature. Like there's something of the nature of what it is to be Shiv. I can't quite put into words or explain to you, but that emerges quite spontaneously. Then there's the added manipulation of that expression in order to suit a certain social situation, whether that be work, whether that be a spiritual discourse, or whatever it might be. That's an added layer of manipulation that happens. Now, you could argue that's part of your nature to manipulate it, but I, intuitively have felt that every time I do that extra layer of management or manipulation, there's something of my energy that's sucked out of me, and I'm left drained at the end of that process. And you continue that long enough, you begin to enter this state of existential depletion that eventually precipitates into an existential breakdown and all of that. Whereas if I'm simply expressing myself as it spontaneously arises, again, I don't know whether that's truly authentic or not, but I can only gauge based on the impacts, the energy levels, the exuberance of it. I am able to be exuberant and energetic at all times when I'm not manipulating the way I express, when I'm just simply, the words that are coming out of my mouth, similar to how you said you can't keep your mouth shut. I can't keep my mouth shut, but I could if I really put the effort into it. But then that would take something away. It would require investment.
I guess what I mean by that is, what is, you used the word survival before, or real. what is that is trying to survive? Because when stuff flies out of me, which is often, is it trying to survive? Is it a life or death situation? Is it threatened in some way? And let's say that I'm in some situation which has in my life has occurred many times, again, because I cannot control the mouth. Let's say I say something that I regret or that hurts somebody. What is authenticity in that moment? And what if I feel bad about it later? What is feeling bad? It's again, it's not the body. Is it, and what I don't know what essence means.
I think it is the body. In
Do you
part.
think muscles and bones care what my mouth says?
Not muscles and bones, but I mean, emotions feel very somatic to me.
They do
In part.
feel that.
They seem to have two components, a thinking component and or an image component, and also a felt component, a sensory component in the body. And
So-
which can actually play out in terms of physical health, et cetera, et cetera.
I understand this, and I don't know how much you guys want to get into this. This is a place where I go where very few people go. I end up with a point of view that very few people have. But I will say that if I understand that it feels very real, feelings in the body, and I live in the same world you guys do. I have feelings like everybody else, and they feel very real. I get that. And we live in a world that honors those feelings very much. And we also live in a world where whether we like the feeling or we don't like the feeling becomes extremely important to us. But if, my clients have heard this up the wazoo, if you felt, let's say, anxiety,
Mhm.
and went to a doctor or a surgeon, and they cut you open, would they find anxiety? Is it in there? Is it? I know it feels.
No, but
like
I mean,
it.
what I would say, what's unreal, like when you say emotion seems real, but you suggest it maybe isn't. It seems to me that the sensations in the body are very real as sensations. And it seems to me that the thoughts, wait a minute, that the thoughts are very real as thoughts. What's unreal might be the sort of story behind it all, or the self-image behind it all, or something like that. But the experience is real as an experience.
The experience is certainly real. And I apologize for interrupting you. This is a subject that I end up spending a lot of time on, and a lot of discussions about. The experience of feelings in the body is different from whether they're actually in the body. They're not in the body.
This is something interesting. Where they've done MRI scans and heat maps, documenting the impact of emotions on the central nervous system, the body's endocrine system, the circulatory system, hormonal changes. And if you look at these heat maps, it's fascinating to see how different emotions have physical impacts on the body. So you'll see anxiety as there's red zones, orange zones, blue zones, pink zones. I'm not an expert on how those zones are broken up, but essentially it gives you an understanding of how the body responds physiologically to these emotions. So whether emotions can be found in the body, not in the muscle and bones, but you will find it in the central nervous system.
You will find the impact, not the feeling.
Sure.
Well,
sure.
I think,
No, wait.
Well, one could argue you'll find the impact of physical sensations also in the central nerve. We can't truly say whether a table is hard. Perhaps it's only the impact on the central nervous system.
Correct. I think
says
that's
hardness.
significant. I think that's something not to be ignored. And
so I guess you're coming from a position where, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but borderline solipsist position, which says that anything truly experienceable can only be known through its impacts, can never be known for what it actually is. So we don't actually know if there's a world out there. All we know
Yeah.
is the impact on our sort of central nervous
Yeah,
system
and
of
I'm not-
something.
I'm not denying the impact and the fact that we feel that it's real. I'm not denying any of that. I have found that noticing that it might not actually be real, that feeling that feels real might not actually be real, can be can take us places we don't get to go when we're all focused on feeling a feeling or validating a feeling or assuming that a feeling simply because we feel it is a thing.
Yeah, I think
let me-
that's the key. That's the key, is that it's not a thing. In other words, that's why if you cut open the body, you won't find, you won't find fear. You won't find, you might find the impacts of fear if you cut open the body, but you won't find fear. You won't find a self if you cut open the body.
Correct.
You won't find this experience we're having right now if you cut open the body or cut open the brain or anything. But at the same time, well, I guess it comes down to what we mean by real. I think what you're sort of pointing to is that, if I'm hearing you right, is that it doesn't have any sort of inherent, persisting, objective kind of thingness reality out there somewhere. It's like more like
It's a concept.
it's an experience. Well, once we label it, once we have the experience that we're calling fear, let's say, which is a combination of thoughts and sensations and all that. And then when we put a label on it, like this is fear or this is anxiety, then we've sort of conceptually made it into something that seems like a solid thing. And I think it can be very helpful to see that it's not really solid. It's not what you think it is and all that. But I wouldn't go so far as to say it's not real.
Yeah, so
Maybe we're just languaging it differently, but that
No, I
feels
think
like-
this is a
and
distinct
I
difference
agree
in
with
point of view,
Joan.
and I understand that nobody else but me seems to have this
No,
point
no,
of view.
no. What it is, Judy, is I see a therapeutic value to what you're saying, because it is therapy. There is a therapeutic value to show somebody the illusory nature of what they are taking to be absolutely concrete, 100%. But when you then take it from the standpoint, if you cut open the body, which you're inadvertently saying, well, the body has a reality to it, which I could also dispute, because I could
Yes.
tell you my
Me
chair,
too.
my chair is very uncomfortable, and all I need to do is realize the chair doesn't exist. It's just a bunch of molecules moving around in space.
I'm not
And-
saying that.
No. I'm saying that. I'm saying,
Yeah,
I could train my mind to see that the discomfort I feel from the chair is a sensation being created by my central nervous system, and that discomfort actually doesn't exist because the chair is actually not a solid object, because we can then, just like you can cut open the body and not find an emotion, I can cut open reality with an electron microscope and see that in the quantum world, physicality and the solidity of things doesn't really exist. It's an illusion created also by our central nervous systems. At that level, even the body that you're cutting open doesn't exist. So there are many relative levels of illusion, is the point I'm trying to get to, and that there's a benefit to revealing an illusion at the right time. But the totality of experience is just illusion upon illusion upon illusion.
agreed.
Turtle upon turtles upon turtles. Taking the turtles out of the equation isn't the ultimate solution. Is
It can't be
roundabout
done.
way of what I'm trying to get to is, at some point, you have to live with the illusion, and it will always feel real, whether you like it or not. So how do you do that? That's the point, is you can see through the illusion. It will give you some temporary respite, but that emotion is still going to hurt. And you can keep telling yourself you can't open the body, the emotion's not there, but it feels, if you can feel it, it hurts. So then what? So there's a practical aspect to how to live with these illusions. It's just all illusions at the end of the day. It's just simply illusions and nothing else. But what is reality then? But the sum total of all illusions.
Well, hold on a second. I really need to pee, and I don't want it to bring in the mundane, and I don't really want to miss anything. So can we all take a 3-minute break or something?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Can you guys
So-
promise
Sure.
that you're not going to carry on without me?
I will mute and stop my video.
Okay.
I'm just going to talk to myself. All right, I'm gonna pause the recording and we'll pick it up when Joan comes back. Pause. There we go. All right, so we're picking up where we left off.
Given that we were just about to find out what reality is, I didn't want to be in the bathroom when that finally happened and then miss it.
Because we definitely have the answers.
Yeah,
The
that's
three
what
of
I'm-
us. We know. So
But by the way, I get most of my answers in the bathroom. Just sharing that little piece of information.
so
Well,
what is
yeah.
speaking to you there, Shiv? You're
I-
scaring me.
It may have something to do with letting go. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's part of the process. There's an enlightenment that happens, you know?
No pun intended.
So we were on the point, Judy, where we were talking about seeing the illusion of the emotion. And I think that's one of the therapeutic approaches you take that really helps people caught up in the identification with emotional states, is to see that ultimately they are illusory, often illusory in nature.
The thing is, I really want to be clear that I'm not sitting around intellectually saying to people and helping clients intellectually get, I'm not anything, you're not anything, feelings aren't real, none of this is real. This useless bullshit in terms of how we experience this life. And you've got so many of these spiritual parrots running around saying that kind of thing. Well, who is there to be anxious? It's just like, shut up. But I think that there is a new door. There is a new experience that happens when we consider, even for a brief moment, I'm not talking about how you live your life. When you notice for a moment that these feelings that we live and die by, and we judge whether we have a good day or not by, may not be what we think they are and may not be important. I'm not even saying they are or aren't. I think that there's a different door and a different experience that happens. And for a lot of folks who are trying to understand in a lived way this no self and no reality business, this is an entry that nobody considers. These feelings that we take to be so important and so real and so very there that nobody ever considers otherwise. And so that door never gets opened.
I think people, I think there actually are, I mean, I've been with many teachers who do point to that, and I do think it's really helpful to sort of see the ephemeral, transient, ungraspable, unresolvable nature of this whole thing, life. And so that we tend to think of as, very solid. And certainly we give a lot of importance to feelings, and in a certain kind of therapeutic model and therapeutic culture, we give a certain kind of importance to feelings that is very exaggerated, I feel, and can be very unhelpful. So
Let me also add
I
that
appreciate what you're saying. I just, I guess the word, ironically, my first website ever was called What Is Real? And I've never found the answer, but it just seems, if I had to say, I would just say, well, everything is reality. or nothing is real, but everything is reality. But I'm, if I can shift the discussion a little, I'm really interested in sort of exploring this thing about like Shiv, you seem to be really sort of putting forward the notion that just kind of being exactly as we are, which of course we can't really not be. But I mean, which would include everything, being angry, da 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 da. And I found that a very liberating perspective. I've heard from other people too, a very liberating perspective, and it's sort of getting beyond the sort of spiritual management trip where you're trying to, kind of manage yourself and be a better person or something. But on the other hand, as I was saying earlier, isn't there some value? Like, to me, it feels like when I get defensive and reactive on Facebook, for example, it feels painful, and sometimes I say something snarky and maybe hurtful to the other person, etc. And so it feels like there's something, and I'm not sure if this is true, I'm really questioning this, but isn't there something valuable in sort of being able to see that, and maybe in the seeing of it, eventually it drops away kind of naturally, or lessens, or gets thinner or something, like, because it does feel like I don't feel really good about getting really angry at somebody and saying all kinds of hurtful things to them. It doesn't feel, and I can go to the place of, well, maybe it how do I know? Maybe it's a great thing for them, and maybe it was, and it's the only thing that could have happened, and blah blah blah. But still, it feels like there's some interest here in sort of, I guess, and just for my own peace of mind, maybe just cultivating some kind of, I don't know, this is,
Do you feel like that cultivating has worked over the years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't feel like I've achieved any kind of perfection. I still get triggered, I still get reactive, I still get hurt, I still get defensive, I still get angry, I still say things I regret. All of that can still happen. And I still have days when I feel very dark mood and kind of what you might call depression. But I can say that that things feel infinitely better than they did many years ago, just in terms of less, I don't get into the kind of deep depression that I did many years ago. And if it's there, it doesn't. And when these things happen, I don't go into a whole thing of beating myself up about it that I might have done previously. When I do something that I regret, I don't sort of go into this beating myself up thing that I used to do. And it does seem to happen less often and than it did once. I mean, when I was a drunk, I was like, I literally destroyed a whole house. I threw the television through the window, and I mean, literally, I smashed every piece of furniture. I had a lot of rage, and it's been years since I did anything. I haven't done anything like that since I sobered up, but I mean, it's been years since I've gotten so angry that I was throwing things or anything like that, but I do feel like there's been a change. But it certainly hasn't been, it's not like perfection, and I'm not looking for perfection or expecting perfection, but I guess I do have some kind of interest in seeing and bringing to light the Hitler side of me, and maybe letting that fall away more, and also cultivating in some way or other the Buddha side of me. And I'm using those just as symbolics, but am I alone in that, or is that just, I don't know.
I do see a value in certain kinds of pointers, because you have to keep in mind that my books are geared towards a certain kind of individual, the kind of individual that has already been introspective enough in their life to be able to cultivate a certain degree of awareness about themselves. And it's probably swung to the other extreme, where they become so hyper-aware that they become obsessed with constant self-management, tweaking themselves, watching themselves. And that's turned into its own neurotic endeavor. And they're then suffering from that malaise. And so my work is more geared towards kind of presenting the other side, the other view. It says this whole thing of trying to transcend yourself is pointless, because all your introspection has done is just shown you who you are. It has not really shown you how to solve the problem of self, because yourself was never a problem to begin with. That's essentially what I'm saying. But if you take somebody who's never even begun to introspect into themselves, and you then tell them, oh, you're exactly as you are, it doesn't quite click in the same way. They might completely misunderstand the message. It's the equivalent of telling somebody who's worked, 80-hour weeks for the last 5 years, relax, take some time, just enjoy life, versus the guy who doesn't lift a finger to do any work. You tell them the same thing, they're going to go, oh yeah, great, that's great, I've been doing that the whole time. Well, it's not really the same message applicable to the same person. So do I value pointers that direct people to introspect into themselves? 100%. I think that's very useful. I gave a pointer like that to my 9-year-old daughter who takes gymnastics. She's training on a gymnastics competitive program. She was recently bumped up to level 3, and her friends are still in level 2. And the coach came to me after one of the training sessions. She goes, "Your daughter was gloating a little bit to her friends." And I go, yeah, she has a tendency to do that. And so I had a little chat with her, and she was really upset that I called her out on it. And I said, it might be useful to sometimes just put yourself in the other person's shoes, and how would you have felt about that if that had happened to you? And she said, not very good. And I said, well, maybe try to do that sometimes when you're not sure. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. And a little pointer like that. Now, is that a useful pointer? I think so. But does she need to obsess about it? I don't think so. It's part of her nature to showboat a little bit. And I actually don't think there's anything terribly wrong with that. So it's always the balance between a suggestion and then leaving it up to the individual to then figure their way out. But and I was actually talking to somebody recently about this, whether they see the value in what I'm saying. She says it resonates with me, but this one thing always bothers me, because you're so categorical in your denunciation of teachers and the culture. And I said to her, that's probably the one drop of dishonesty I have to intentionally sprinkle into my writing, because otherwise, if I'm too nuanced, the impact of it will just be lost. It becomes too diluted. There's a point to my writing. It's supposed to snap people out of a certain level of hypnosis, and you can't do it by gently nudging them. You have to slap them in the face. And sometimes a slap in the face has to be crude. It can't be too nuanced. And so I will always intentionally leave out that little part of me that knows there's some value to everything in life. There's nothing in life that's that black and white. But I need to present a certain way. Maybe when I'm not writing as Advaitaholics Anonymous, that'll be a bit more nuanced in certain aspects of it. But when it comes to this culture, because I've seen the impact that this culture has had on people and the way it's molded their minds, nothing short of blunt force trauma will do it. It can't be something more subtle than that.
I'm going to make that my theme song for my work. Blunt force trauma. That's I'm in. I think that I have a whole lot of clients that would agree that that is a pretty good description of working with me. My client base is slightly different from what you're describing as your readership, Shiv, but the idea is kind of similar. I think that we are inevitably, I'm working with people who are anxious, who are depressed, who are unmotivated, who are unproductive, who are unable to get out of bed to some degree or others. Sometimes it's not that obvious, but they're hurting in some way. And they've tried everything. They've tried feeling the feelings. They've tried going inward. They've tried trying to figure out who they are. They've gone to therapy and gotten all the explanations. They've tried meditation. There's a point at which, and medication, there's a point at which for a certain population, none of that works. There's a point at which they're hurting enough that they'll try not existing. And they'll try challenging standard beliefs. They'll try because they have nothing left to lose. And I think the idea of, you know, when we talk about being a better person or being somebody that we like, I mean, we all know what that means. Nobody would characterize Hitler as a good person. We know what better person means, and that's something that isn't even necessarily cultural. It doesn't particularly change over geographic location or et cetera. We know what it means, but it is a story. It is a human imposed concept. My cat does not worry about being a good cat or a better cat. That's a human notion. And when we start to see how much of our speaking of which, hello, did you feel me summon you? Is
yeah,
that
my cat heard about your cat, and my cat said, oh, I can do better than your cat can.
And that would not be hard to do. My little kitty is old and sick. So perhaps.
So is this one. She's 16 years old.
Oh, so
yeah, but she's not sick.
I think she may be gloating, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
She's a superior kitty. I think that sense of who we are gets so requires so much maintenance and so much protection and so much image making that it is so automatic. We don't even feel that it's inauthentic. We don't feel, it feels like who we are. And so if we see ourselves, let's say, as a good person, or which the mind doesn't let a lot of us see ourselves that way, actually. Or if we see ourselves as inadequate or unlovable or messed up or broken, you know, I'm not saying that that image can't change. Of course, the image can change, the sense of who we are can change. I was telling somebody recently, using as an example, I used to be a white knuckle flyer. I used to be afraid to fly. That's gone. I used to be suicidal most of my life, well into my 50s. I won't say that's gone. That has not showed up in a long time. Will it show up again? Maybe, I don't know. It hasn't in a long time. So, you know, when we talk about transcending or being who we are, I mean, what are we talking about? What is it possible? Your cat is cracking me up. Is it possible for essence, whatever that is, to transcend or to change? And if it's not, then what is changing?
I don't think there is an essence. I mean, I would agree.
I would agree.
I would at least question, you know, the story of having an essence, but because I don't think there's some essential Joan in here, you know.
Right.
But Joan is a bunch of things that are always changing and in flux and in relationship to everything else, and you know, so I don't think there's an essential Joan. I would even question the notion that being or presence is unchanging and essentially here. It may be, and I always kind of thought it was, but I'm not sure. And so, yeah, I don't know that there's an essence, and it's certainly, you know, I don't think it's helpful to think of ourselves as a good person or a bad person or any of that.
So the way I see essence is in a much more naturalistic way. I like to think of I have a bunch of trees in the backyard, very old trees. And I like to think of the essence of an oak tree to stand sturdy and provide shade and, you know, weather storms. And I like to think of the essence of a flower or a tulip to be a little bit more ephemeral and to have a very short, fleeting yet impactful, time on earth. And I like to think of the essence of my cat to be uniquely different than the essence of, my or Judy's cat, perhaps. And these are things that are not necessarily personality driven or thought driven or emotion driven or any of those things, but something very more fundamental than that. And I'm not going to speculate on what that fundamental thing is, but I find that when an oak is left to be an oak, it's just simply an oak. And when a cat is left to be a cat, it's simply a cat. And when Shiv is left to be a Shiv, he's simply a Shiv. And the more the energy that's put into manipulating how that shows up, and really that's all it's about, is how much energy is invested in manipulating it as opposed to just it emerging spontaneously.
Except Shiv, it seems to me that humans are different from cats and oak trees in really significant ways, and that we do have this self-reflective consciousness and ability to think in incredibly complex ways that the cat does not have and the oak tree definitely doesn't have. And so it feels like, and I mean, I do think there's certainly a unique expression that's Shiv and a unique expression that's Judy. Okay, I mean, I just don't think it's an essence in the sense that it's something you can actually get hold of. Well,
and this is why I said it. I look at it in more naturalistic rather than the ego identity related to social survival and all of that. So to call it a Shiv immediately is already not the essence of it, because Shiv is a role in society. But I look at every being, and human beings are natural organisms. Yes, we're more complex, but we're natural organisms. We're all responding to information. My cat is responding to information from her environment that even I am not privy to, because her sensory perception is very different from mine. I'm responding to data and information that's coming out of my environment, but also that I'm recycling within my brain, and the ability to parse those out. New data, new information, which is always present moment centric, because that's where any new information comes from, versus old information, which is recycled information. My brain can only come up with old information, but my environment is always providing me new information. So as long as my awareness is more focused on the new information coming in, my essence and my identity and myself is always evolving along with the moment and with the environment, as opposed to if I'm responding to only the old information, then I'm kind of crystallized in that identity, because it's just repeating itself.
Except that all the neuroscience and physics and et cetera is actually indicating that you're not actually available and open to new information. We all have a filter. We must. There's too much data. There's simply too much for these human brains to take in. And so we all have a filter. Some of it's learned, some of it's conditioned, et cetera. We all have a filter. We have a bias. We have a point of view. And everything that happens to us is passed through that sieve. And so you actually, one is not, I don't mean you in particular, of course, we're not available to anything new past the age of, by 7, it's over. But things happen, we have experiences, we experience whatever, and it is passed through this sieve in order for us to understand what's happening. And there's a lot of science about this. So it's actually not, it's just not possible.
I think there's a difference between experiencing and interpreting. I agree with you that we're not interpreting in new ways, because we really can't. We're kind of conditioned, everybody's conditioned, but to say that we're not experiencing anything new, I don't believe is correct, because this moment is new for me. Like, this is a new moment, as opposed to an old moment that I've regurgitated in my head. If I was to relive the same traumatic moment of the past, that is literally not something new. That's literally an old piece of information that I'm re-experiencing over and over, and that's essentially what trauma is. As opposed to this moment, I may interpret this moment given my limited lens of life and all of that, but at least there's a chance that something comes through, as opposed to if I'm caught in my head. Nothing new is ever going to come through because that's an old scenario. It's not even happening anymore. And so I find that no person can intentionally change, but organic change happens the more exposed one is to one's immediate environment. Because the immediate environment is an energetic environment. There's energy bombarding us at all times from every different direction. And the more open the awareness is, the more energy can flow through. It will get interpreted. No doubt it will. But eventually, through that new information coming in, our brains have the ability to reinterpret things over time through experience, through wisdom. And this is how wisdom builds. Wisdom is a sum impact of experiences over a long period of time. You can't become wise, or insights are not wisdom, for example, right? Wisdom accumulates over time and is only really palpable after one has lived a certain amount of life, because it's gradually seeping through this drip, 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 drip of external influences, gradually changing the structure of the brain. Sometimes it can happen in a flash. That's what an awakening tends to be. But really, the more impactful is the drip, 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 drip that comes through in the present moment, if there is an openness. And the more of an openness there is, the more can flow through and impact. But it's not us doing it. It's happening completely despite us, beyond us, right?
I think we're noodling around Joan's question of what is reality. And I mean, obviously, we all have different experiences from second to second and day to day, and the experiences I have today, Joan, when we first got on this call and you said, I have different pictures here behind me. I mean, that's a different experience than the pictures the paintings that were here behind me when we last talked. Of course, new things are happening, and yet people have an amazing ability to squeeze new things into old filters and come up with an old conclusion. I watch people do this all the time, where I'm going to make this a small, stupid example in the hopes of being clear. If I'm working with a client who feels unlovable and nobody's ever loved them and they've never been accepted, et cetera, I watch them ignore evidence of people loving them. They just can't see it. They just can't. It's right there. There was a client I was working with recently where, while they were telling me how unlovable they were, there was a knock at the door with a neighbor bringing them chicken soup. I mean, they were telling me how alone they were, and here was the neighbor with the knock on the door. So I think that, the personality's ability to adapt is variable, and some of us are what we would call more open than others, for sure. But in the end, there is still an immutable filter. So I think that kind of balance between the sense that I have changed, because, for all intents and purposes, I have changed hugely over years, and also have not. I'm still a foul-mouthed, loud-mouthed, boisterous person that has not changed. I don't know how one changes that. So I'm always fascinated, though, by the spiritual community's unending ability to talk about reality, let's say, or transcendence or enlightenment, without ever translating into literal experience. Like, what is the appetite for that? What is the inclination to just talk? I'm not saying that's what we're doing. I'm saying,
well, we are doing that.
We are doing that. We are doing that. When we were talking about getting together here, I was like, I'm talked out. I'm having that same issue with writing this weekly newsletter that, it's like, I'm kind of talked out. I've been doing it for 7 years every week. I got nothing left to say. And I'm in awe of the Robert Saltzmans, the Michael Markhams, everybody else who just seems to have an unending flow of words about all this. I don't, in the end,
you do seem to have quite a flow of words, Judy.
Well, but I mean, if you invite me to talk, I'll talk. We'll meet and talk. But if you don't invite me, I'm perfectly happy to just post funny pictures and not. You know what I mean? I'm talked out.
No, I know that, but I think what you're pointing to is kind of interesting there, because I know the feeling, and I've heard many people who are in similar fields, whatever you want to call that, if we are in similar fields, express a similar thing, that, because I feel this way a lot, like I've kind of said it all, but then in another way, I feel like I'm always discovering new things and questioning how I was seeing it, and then seeing new things. And, I think we can get lost in the weeds around whether, is it ever new, or is it all blah, 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 blah. But, agreed that there's a lot of filtering, and there's also some capacity, I think, for plasticity and new insights and new information and so on. And so it seems like I can kind of feel when something that I'm writing feels stale to me, or it feels like I'm just doing this because I feel like I need to put out a newsletter or something, and it feels stale, versus when feels like there's an aliveness to it. There's a felt difference, yeah. So, but sometimes, there is that sort of, like, we're in this thing where we put out newsletters or something, or like, I mean, it's
Well, I like to compare it to the Bollywood film industry, whereas, in the 70s and 80s, Bollywood, everything was over the top, and the good guy would kick the bad guy, and the bad guy would fly 250 feet across the next town, and that kind of stuff happened, and everybody knew that was fantastical, and there was absolutely no way in real life that kind of stuff would happen, but it was an escape, because India back then, levels of poverty were much higher. The average income, or even a middle-class person, was much lower. Everyone was looking for an escape from their everyday lives. And the more outlandish the film was, the more they enjoyed it, because it was so absolutely opposite to their lived experience of reality. So they wanted the fantasy. What's happened now with Bollywood is become more grounded, and the films are still outlandish in comparison to Hollywood, but compared to the Bollywood of the past, much more grounded, much more realistic, much more sophisticated. That's because the population has become more sophisticated. The population has become more wealthy. They require an escape, but a more sophisticated escape, not something that outlandish that looks comical, but something a little bit more sober. And that's what's happened with the spiritual industry as well. We're still providing an escape. And this is why it's an infinitely renewable resource, because when a person listens, it's not the kind of, and I don't want to point fingers as in we're doing something ulterior. This is not what I'm intending to say, is that in that moment, the person is transported out of their reality into the reality that we are creating as we are speaking to them. Just in that act itself, there's respite from the suffering of their own lives. There's another perspective bearing down that's reforming something, and the experience as they're listening is changed enough that they feel some respite. And even if it doesn't change it for good, changing it temporarily for an hour provides them enough for them to say, wow, phew, that gave me a bit of a break from whatever it is that I call this life. So I will then do it again.
But Shiv, I just want to say that, like, that has been my experience with a certain aspect of the spiritual world, particularly the certain satsang teachers, for example. It feels like you get into sort of a very expanded state with a lot of love and all that sort of thing. But in Zen, or for that matter, Tony Packer's work was quite different. It wasn't about transcending. It wasn't about, having some great awakening experience. It was really about entering your life, entering the moment, and, really being present to being what's here, And so
and
it's a
there's
very different kind of orientation.
But the
and I
moment
think
it's packaged, Joan, the moment it's packaged as the Tony Packer thing, or the moment it's packaged as the Buddhist thing, right there, it becomes not my life. It becomes a Buddhist version of my life, which becomes more palatable. The moment I put on the monk's robes, somehow going about my day feels a bit more special because I'm doing it as a monk now and not a
yeah, well,
Shiv.
that was
Shiv's a bit
exactly
mundane.
that was Tony Packer's whole point. She said all the isms are the problem, and then, as you're pointing out, then she has her own thing, and just as you, Shiv, have your thing, Shivism. And
Right.
it's sort of like it's an unavoidable thing.
It's unavoidable.
And
You
this is
have
why
to
I'm
have
saying
an ism.
we are not excluded from this. You see, even this recording right now
Right.
is ultimately going to be an escape for someone listening to it. There's no way
I
to
don't
avoid
know.
it.
Not a great escape.
Not a great escape, but it might be the appropriate escape. In
I
the
would
moment.
say try Netflix, try Hulu.
This is it. This is the industry of novelty, right? Like ultimately everything can be used as a distraction.
Yeah,
It
sure.
can be used as a distraction. And all this ultimately becomes is providing a potential means for distraction, not necessarily, that's not the intention that's being created, but that could be the outcome.
Distraction is an interesting concept, though. To view things as a distraction is an interesting concept.
Well, it's kind of how our 20s, I was going to say 22nd century, aren't we in the 21st century?
First, yes,
Just had a
21st.
Brain fart for a second.
Grandpa.
Yeah.
He's
Back
the
in
youngest
the
among us,
21st
but
I'm an old soul, Judy. So it's just a feature of our brains. We need some form of distraction to deal with the other form of distraction we become addicted to. Whereas the most mundane reality a human being could possibly imagine is probably the best suited for them, because it is the most desensationalized version of reality. And that's the one I would always point somebody to. What's the most boring, mundane thing you could ever imagine doing right now? Do that. Because
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if, because that sounds like a very popular spiritual idea, actually, that the best thing you could do is just sort of what you did there for a period of time where you just did, you just had nothing in your apartment, no books, nothing, you just sat there. That's like a Zen retreat. That's, it's sort of like.
Right. So that would not be the most boring, mundane thing for Joan. That's my point, is what is the most boring, mundane thing for Joan to do right now? And it might not be sitting in an empty apartment. That might be stimulating for you. So you have to do the opposite of what the ordinary person would find boring and mundane. But the point is to take you to a place of zero hooks for your ego to sort of get off on,
you can't
and then
avoid
encounter
them, though.
that.
I mean, Shiv, when you were, I just noticed the time. I'm going to have to go in a few minutes because it's kitty pilling time. When you were, I think you mentioned last time we talked, maybe when you and I talked, you talked about a period of time where you were depressed and you would sit for long periods of time and just try to get it, this meditation thing or whatever. But again, I'm sure I'm mangling what you said. But when you were depressed, what do you think would have happened if you had just sat there doing the most boring, mundane thing for you? What do you think would have occurred? Do you think that in a depressed situation that you would have been able to tolerate that?
So again, it all depends on how precarious a person's state of mind is. But when I sat on my balcony, firstly, I was at that period of time, not so much depressed as I was anxious and fear-ridden.
Okay.
And the most challenging thing for me to do was what I did. It's the last thing I wanted to do. It's the thing I had to literally force myself to do, which was just sit on that balcony with nothing to distract myself from. And it was agony because it started with boredom. It started with soul-crushing boredom. And then that boredom became a gateway to this floodgate of everything coming out, every demon that's been trapped in there, nonstop, day after day for an entire year until that energy was spent. But that's my point, is it usually goes in the one place you don't want to go. So let's not call it boring and mundane, because that sort of puts a spin on it. But that one place in your life that you really don't want to go is typically where you need to go. And so
But,
if
can I just so I mean, I do agree that spirituality can be really addictive, and it has been and still is in some ways addictive for me. I mean, I have beside my armchair piles of spiritual books that I'm still dipping into. And I just read your book, Shiv, your anti-spiritual spiritual book, which is spiritual. And and I can feel that sometimes it feels addictive and sometimes it doesn't, you know, this whole sort of thing. I don't feel like I'm in search of some enlightenment or final thing or something, but there's still, you know, I can feel that sometimes a spiritual book is something that I will maybe pick up in the same way that I might once have picked up a cigarette or a drink. And in that sense, addictive. But this gets into this whole matter of distraction, because and sort of what one person I know, one Zen teacher actually calls our purification fantasies. And, you know, that I have this thought a lot that, what I really need to do is just sit here like Shiv did for, you know, and I've done this actually also, you know, not in the formal setting of retreats, because then it's like a thing that you're doing. It's a retreat, you know, I've done a lot of that, but just to do it in my living room, you know, okay, no books, no Hulu, no Netflix, no nothing. And, you know, and I'll just be here completely without anything addictive, with no distractions. But what am I doing when I'm doing that? I mean, it could be an interesting experiment, and it does reveal things when you sort of let your addictions go, but it can also be sort of like this new purification thing. Like I'm trying to purify Joan, like what the fuck is wrong with if I read a spiritual book? Or, you know, well, it's better than smoking a cigarette or shooting heroin.
And in that moment, I would probably say, rather than sitting there, that's time to change your colostomy bag, because it's literally what your mind does.
You only do that when it fills up, not
okay. It's what I mean is that it's usually the most mundane and unrelated thing. So, for example, I've been through this process myself where I'll find myself saying, maybe I need to do this. Well, then really what I need to do is something completely unrelated.
But need to do for what purpose? I mean, that's what I'm sort of getting at.
Well, and that's my point. And that's my point is because there's a purpose that I am projecting, there's therefore a strategy that I'm then creating to achieve that purpose. But my life has nothing to do with that imagined purpose, which is why the Zen teaching of chop wood, carry water is probably the most powerful and most necessary and the only teaching anybody need ever concern themselves with, which is chop wood, carry water. It means nothing. It means just do the next thing.
Yeah.
There's literally all there is to life is to do the next thing. But we create artificial purpose and artificial meaning and artificial angst and artificial problems and artificial solutions. And so because Shiv sat on a balcony, Joan is going to try and sit on her balcony. But that's not
because of you. I mean, I've done this before myself, but no, it's like, what's wrong with I just lost my train of thought. Hold on.
Distraction.
Yeah. Like chop wood, carry water, or in the modern version might be, you know, check Facebook, drive down freeway or something. But, you know, you're sitting there in the evening. Maybe this never happens because you have kids and stuff. But let's say you're 74 years old and you're sitting there in the evening and you don't have any kids and, you know, you don't have any more meetings to do. You're just sitting, it's the evening. What do? You can just sit there, which I sometimes do, or you can read a book, or you can watch a movie,
It's all chop wood, carry water. You have
Right,
to
that's
do
what I'm-
something.
That's what I'm kind of,
One can't do nothing. That's not possible for us. And so it's whether we think it's chop wood or carry water because we're paying attention to it, because we're valuing it, because we're honoring it or not, we're still chopping wood and carrying water. We're existing, that you can't not. I think that this idea that there's a better way to be, or a right way to do things, or a thing you can do that will take you someplace, all of that I think is ultimately confused. I think
but when
it's
you're working
confused.
with clients, are you trying to, I mean, income stream aside, do you see it as something that may be helpful to them, or?
I think it turns out that it is. Do I see it that way? Sometimes. I mean, I feel like there's I'm sorry, I call attention to that phrase, I feel like, often, and so I just heard it escape my face. Ask me another way, ask me your question another way, if you don't mind. What are you asking me? Is there
Well,
some
I heard-
value to
yeah,
it?
no, I heard you sort of saying that there's no point in, or I'm putting this in my own words now, there's no, because I am definitely getting senile. There's no point in,
So am I.
there's no point in kind of trying to improve or something like that.
Well, I mean,
and I feel like, to be honest, as I said in my book on death, The End of Self-Improvement, it feels to me like there's a certain kind of self-improvement that feels very toxic and unhelpful and blah, 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 which was what I was referring to as the end of self-improvement. But there's also a kind of genuine transformation or interest in being Buddha, in cultivating the Buddha and seeing through the Hitler, or whatever, however you want to put that, that feels like a natural part of human beings. Like we have a kind of a natural impulse to want to cure disease and fix social problems, and
I think it's not natural for everybody.
no,
So I don't think
really not
it's
for-
so.
no.
In which case, it's not natural. It's learned.
But
But
some people's nature, maybe not
Well,
everyone's.
and that's where the chop wood carry water pointer is not just a mundane do something. It's do what is appropriate to the moment, and that's not an intellectual activity to figure out. Because what is appropriate to the moment may not be appropriate to you. What do you think you want to do? They're two different things.
the thing,
And we're often distracted and often taken away, carried away by what we feel we need to do. I want to do this. I need to do this. I'm afraid if I don't do this, all of that often, like your example, check Facebook, most likely has nothing to do with what is appropriate in any given moment. And so that comes right back to the understanding of one's nature and being authentic, because when one is authentic, then what one does is appropriate to most situations, not always, but in general is appropriate to the situation. Then you're living effortlessly because you're doing things appropriate to the moment. Nothing is out of whack, nothing is out of sync. And therefore the feedback you're getting from your environment is not a backlash of suffering that you're then having to endure because you're doing things completely out of whack and out of sync with reality. Because your brain is off on a tangent at all times. Not you, but the general you. The brain's always off on a tangent. And as long as it's projecting, it knows reality. It's going to be acting in some weird, fantastical dimension, and its actions will be somewhat irrelevant to what's actually going on. And that's the dichotomy. That's the alienation. And until we have a clear alignment with nature, with our own nature, I don't want to get into, what semantics of what authenticity means, but there is a certain alignment where you are very comfortable in your own skin. There's not much conflict in there, not much dissonance in there. Then chop wood, carry water has an application, because then you're literally doing the next appropriate thing for the moment as the moment requires it to be done. other than that, it just becomes an exercise in theoretical things, or should I do this in order to achieve this purpose?
Well, no, clearly chop wood, carry water was not meant to say that, you should just sit around thinking about how you've ruined your whole life and nobody loves you, and that would be chopping wood and carrying water. It's clearly pointing to something more like wash the dishes,
Pick up your socks,
garbage, etc. Change your whatever. But anyway, back to Judy. Yeah,
because I am the most fascinating thing here. So let's make sure. Well, I do have to say that again, I understand that I have a weird point of view about many things, including one's nature and authenticity. I just these are and even the idea of distraction, are we saying that dopamine is bad? I mean, so I don't know if you guys do TikTok at all.
No.
Do either of you do TikTok? Don't start.
No, I won't.
Seriously, do not start. It's much better as an addictive platform than any of the other social medias. Much better. It's ferocious in its addictive nature, and for all kinds of reasons, which we won't go into now. But so TikTok will show you things that aren't necessarily from friends or people you follow. And so they're constantly presenting you with things. And then they track what you watch, and they track how much you watch. So if they send you a picture of kittens being saved and you watch it, they're going to send you more kittens being saved.
They all do this. So does Facebook. They all do this. This is the...
They do. It's more ferocious on TikTok. And so what's happened is that now my TikTok is full of Chinese dramas, because I made the mistake of watching something that came across my path, a little clip of some Chinese speaking historical drama, similar to the Bollywood you were describing, Shiv, full of absurdity, with men doing martial arts and flying through the air. And I made the mistake of watching that clip. And so now my TikTok is full of non-English speaking. I don't speak any other language, non-English speaking, hyper fantasized drama. I can feel the dopamine climbing as I watch this stuff. I can literally feel it flooding. Is this bad? Should this not be happening? Is this a distraction?
Well, it's a question.
Well, I think the word distraction is very, like I'm always, when I have, sort of silence before an event or something, I always say nothing that happens is a distraction. Nothing that happens in your mind or in the room is a distraction, or it doesn't need to be seen that way. So I was questioning the word distraction. I mean, authenticity, like for a serial killer, being authentic is running around killing people. I mean,
yeah,
is that good or bad?
I have a hard time with the word. Yeah.
And if I were a serial killer, would I perhaps, probably wouldn't, because I might be a psychopath or something, but would I have an interest in perhaps shifting that behavior?
Well, I think this word authenticity, I don't see why it, trips people up, because it's quite an obvious thing. If Judy is able to look at, Chinese martial artists flying through the air and call it fantastical, then she's saying it's not authentic. It's not authentic to lived human experience, which is that we don't fly in the air. So it's a very straightforward thing. Authentic means, real to the extent that we know real to be. Versus completely unreal, obviously unreal. When we look at politicians like Justin Trudeau, and we call them hypocrites, we're calling them hypocrites because we know they're being inauthentic in the way they present themselves. There's clearly a different version of Justin Trudeau that he's not allowing us to see. Versus, some other politicians or the leaders that, or let's say you listen to Dalai Lama, you're not feeling maybe he's as much of a hypocrite as Justin Trudeau, because he seems to be at least presenting as if he's coming from a truer place than that. So
But
that's
anyone
the
who has a
extent.
public persona is going to appear different in their public persona. Whether
Sure,
it's the
but
Dalai
when
Lama
we-
Which brings us full circle to our conversation that happened before we hit record, where we were talking about the presentation of certain public facing people. So
But for example, my wife, if she were to watch this video, this conversation between us, she would say, oh, it's a very same Shiv that I encounter at home every day. My kids would attest to that as well. So my public persona, for example, this is a public persona. It is, after all, on a public stage. I'm a somewhat public personality writing these books and readers watching it. And, the people in my personal life will attest that this is the very same Shiv. So in degrees, from a relative standpoint, I am perhaps more authentic than some of the people we discussed before we started this
But
recording.
you're in a field where that kind of authenticity is your thing. That's welcomed, as opposed to if you were the prime minister of a country or the president, you would have to get votes and appeal to all these different people. And
well,
so
that would be a choice. That would be a choice, because
it would be
I
a
can tell you-
choice, but if you didn't make that choice, you wouldn't get elected.
But for example, in my line of business, line of work, where I have a full-time job in IT and we sell software. It's a completely different world. I'm just as much as myself, and that may benefit in certain aspects. In certain aspects, it doesn't. The point is, there is such a thing called authentic expression, and this, I think, we're all agreeing on that here in saying that it's a choice. And it is determined by the industry and all of that. But there's such a thing as an expression that can be tweaked or not tweaked. That's all we're really talking about here. And some people actually believe they don't have a choice in tweaking it. They believe they must tweak it. And some people have tweaked it to the extent that they don't understand the non-tweaked version of it, right? And that's really kind of what I'm saying here, is that in baby steps, from the time we're children, we're taught to doctor the image a little bit, spin it, similar to how you would do on Instagram, add in a filter here, add in a filter there, little bit of makeup, remove a blemish, take away a couple of wrinkles, and suddenly a slightly altered version of a self. We're doing that psychologically. And I'm just pointing to the fact that it's an optional activity to engage in.
It's optional in certain situations. It may not be optional if you want to keep a job, for example. Like if you're a woman in corporate media who appears on network TV as an anchor, I don't think you have a choice about whether you show up in a dress and 6-inch heels to do your news broadcast. I don't think you have a choice. I think you don't have a choice of, if you want the job, if you want to keep the job.
So again, authenticity, I don't think has to do with removing all limitations. I don't think that's authenticity, not for me. Like, just because I'm wearing a shirt doesn't mean I'm being inauthentic. Sitting naked here wouldn't be authentic.
No, but
either.
if you were wearing 6-inch heels right now, and a woman's top,
I'm picturing.
yeah, and knowing this is going maybe to be put out online, maybe you wouldn't feel quite so authentic and comfortable in your skin.
Well, then I would have to question why I'm doing it. Is my choice to endure 6-inch heels and perpetuate the self-image an authentic desire? Because if it is, I don't think I'd have a problem putting on the 6-inch heels. The 6-inch heels would be a non-issue to me if I truly believed I need to be on this stage come hell or high water. But if the 6-inch heel is a stumbling block, maybe, just maybe, this is not the platform for me. Maybe I need to find another platform where I don't need to wear the 6-inch heels. The point is, all of this is the process of introspection and coming into a deeper understanding of our own nature. My nature will dictate whether the 6-inch heels is a sticking point or not. Is it going to be a hang-up? I can tell you, I would, in order to be on the Zoom, I would still put on the 6-inch heels gladly if I get to talk to the two of you. If you told me we're not going to talk to you without the 6-inch heels, all right, I'd definitely
Judy and
put
I
them
will
on.
get together. Judy and I will get together and come up with what we think is going to be required for the next.
I'm in. I'm in,
Well,
Joan. We're
We'll
And
let
you
you
know
know.
what? And I might come back with Joan and Judy. I don't think you guys are worth it. I'm not sure.
Damn. I was feeling so good about myself for a minute there.
But I get your
I-
point, Joan. And
I am going to have to sign off, you guys. I have a cat that needs her medication, so I'm going to have to sign off. I say that with as much authenticity as I can drum up.
But is your cat just a distraction, Judy?
Yes. And the more she throws up all over my stuff, the more distracted I am. Yes.
And is that throw up real?
you might have to cut it open to find out, Joan. Well, thank you both for doing this, because after the last one, I felt like we needed another one, and this has been great. And I think we're going to need yet another one after this at some point to finish up where we left off, because I think there's still so much more to discuss. And from my own perspective, everything I offer is just a perspective. And I think Judy's perspective has value, Joan's perspective has value. And the most important thing to really realize is a lens is all this is, right? Like none of
For
us
sure.
truly has a grasp on reality. And that's
Except that I'm right.
Well, we knew that. We did know that. Shiv and I are just trying to hold ourselves together. But yes, it's
I mean, I just pointed out it's obvious.
Thank you. I mean, we're friends talking, and we're sharing points of view, and that's all we could ever do. And this was fun for me. So
Me too. I really enjoyed it. I love you both, and it was great.
agreed.
well, the illusion of the feeling is mutual, Joan.
I think much dopamine here.
Have a wonderful day, both of you.
Take care.
Talk
Bye.
soon.